Good afternoon, everybody. It's lovely to see so many of you here in the new permanent virtual world. I'm Ian Bamford from the Centre for Industrial Sustainability. I'll be hosting this webinar this afternoon. So the aim of these webinars is really to give you access to the experience, the capabilities and the knowledge that we have in the Centre for Industrial Sustainability. We think and we hope that this will help you to be able to drive your sustainability activities and interests far further and faster than might otherwise have been the case. So this particular webinar will run for 1 hour. The format will be that there will be 2 presenters. The first of those will be Professor Steve Evans, who'll be talking about why sustainability makes business sense. And the second will be Gary Panter, who'll be giving a case study based on his experience at AB Sugar and how circular economy approaches can convert waste into value. We'll then go into a 30-minute Q&A that may well be not led by me, but by Rob Driver, who is one of our colleagues. The background to where we come from as the Centre of Industrial Sustainability is that we set this operation up in 2011. Steve was the founder. I was able to support him in getting that set up in place. We're part of the Institute for Manufacturing at Cambridge University, and our work really is about researching and understanding how to create impact in business for sustainability. Over the years, we've worked with over 350 different companies, so we have a depth of experience and knowledge that comes from practice as well as research. We advise governments in the UK and globally, and we have around 30 staff working with us in different areas. We will be addressing questions during the Q&A based on the many that we had in advance. We've had over 50 questions asked in advance. Please do add other questions in as we run through this, and we'll try and blend those together with some of the ones that we've had in advance in order to really address the questions that seem to be most prevalent amongst you. So if I can just introduce the speakers and then we'll move on. Professor Steve Evans, who will start, founder of the Centre for Industrial Sustainability and the Director of Research, has spent 30 years of his life operating and working in this area, and I think we can safely say is now regarded as a world expert. He is an advisor to chief executives of FTSE 100 and Fortune 500 companies. He advises presidents and parts of the United Nations, and he's going to give a very powerful start to this series. Gary Panter had 30 years of his career at AB Foods, where he exited as the Chief Technology Officer, now retired, and we're fortunate to have him join us as a Senior Industrial Fellow at the Centre. During his working life, he not only designed but also built and operated factories across the world, and so has a real depth of knowledge and information. So with that, I'd like to hand over to Steve Evans and take a back seat. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Steve Evans. Most of us love to make things. We get into manufacturing because we enjoy that process of taking raw materials and turning it into something of value, and we're incredibly good at it. In fact, we're so good at it that we've made products available to the whole world at a price that so many more people can afford than, say, 100 years ago or 200 years ago. The unintended consequence of that is that we've overwhelmed the world with externalities, with different forms of pollution, with climate change, with the speed with which we can extract resources. So clearly, industry, through its own success, has to learn how to change. And we've been studying that for a long time. And this afternoon, I just want to take you through one of the most important research questions that we study. We're engineering researchers, so you might imagine the picture on the left that we're busy working away in our laboratories trying to invent new technology to solve the problem, but it's not true. Most of our time, it's more like the picture on the right, except without such a beautiful view. We're in factories asking questions every day of people who make real things. So we're trying to find out what works and what doesn't work for those factories who go on sustainability journeys. Today, we're going to concentrate on one of our number one questions: how efficient can we be with existing technology? Later in the seminar series, we're going to talk about the answers to the questions. Well, what if we could buy new technology? What technology should we use? We're going to ask, what if we change the way we exchange value? And we might even spend some time imagining what the future would look like. I'll give some hints about those, but let's get on with talking about the most important subject of all: being efficient. When you want to be efficient, it's good to have a general target, and then we cascade that down into specific targets. And I want to be very clear. If manufacturing is going to play a sensible part in the world by 2050, we will have to treble our output. We will have to make more stuff, because more people will be rich and they will demand the sorts of products that we make. That's the good news. The challenging news is that by 2050, every factory in the world will have to be a clean neighbor. No pollution into the air, into the soil, or into the water. We will have to emit 100% less greenhouse gases, of which CO2 is the most prominent. And we're going to have to learn how to do all of that while reducing the take of resources by 50%. So those are really significant challenges. And we've asked people and work with people trying to find out how the heck we might get there. And I'm going to suggest that the first step in moving to such a radical future isn't that radical at all. It's learning how to be incredibly efficient. Manufacturing is an efficiency machine. We are incredibly good at making labor efficiency improvements and capital equipment efficiency improvements. I'm going to suggest that we have to use those same skills and focus on energy, water, and waste, and make the use of those incredibly efficient. That's the aim of the seminar today, to talk about efficiency. Later on in the series, we'll be talking about the other three blue boxes, and I'll give a hint later this afternoon on what that might contain. But let's talk about efficiency. We ask really simple questions. I think this is a really simple question. Which is the most energy efficient car factory in Europe? But having tried to answer the question for 10 years and failing, you realize that the question is incredibly important and incredibly impossible. You go to a different car factory that uses less energy to make a car, but what you find is that they're doing their painting in another plant. So there's no painting energy in their calculation, and it gets incredibly complicated. So we slightly altered the question: which is the most energy efficient car factory journey in Europe? So we're really interested in progress over time. And you can look at the report, you can look at the slides. There is a website to help you access some of this boring detail. But basically, I can tell you that the car factory in Europe that is improving fastest is the Toyota factory near Derby. It improves at about 8% per annum in energy efficiency, and it's done that every year for 14 years. What does that mean? That means a 77% reduction in energy, it means they can make 4 cars for the energy that they used to take to make 1. And I want us to pause and just think about the power of this for a minute. Every factory I know is really good at being efficient. Otherwise, you'd be out of business. So what this suggests is that we already have the skills of continuous improvement and being efficient, but we apply those skills mainly to labor efficiency and capital equipment efficiency. If we applied it to energy efficiency, how far could your factory go? And the good thing here is that that puts money in your pocket. That uses a skill that you already have, but focuses it in a slightly different direction. How big might the prize be? Well, we've made a calculation, and we collected data across car sectors, bread making, furniture, and a few others, and we looked at the very best factories and the average factories and even the worst. And we asked the question, if every factory in a sector moved towards the best in its own sector, so a performance that is already feasible and proven, what would that mean? That would mean 24% more profit on average across all of those factories. It would actually create jobs. Job creation mainly comes from material efficiency. If you want to be more material efficient, quite often you replace buying virgin materials with jobs that allow you to reuse older materials, and that's why more jobs are created. If we all matched the best in our own sector, we would deliver about 9% less greenhouse gases than today. Those are prizes worth having. And we chose to emphasize in this webinar the benefits of efficiency because they are so enormous and because they are based on competencies that many of us already have. And our first encouragement is that you learn how to adjust the skills that you already have and get those skills focusing away from labor efficiency and onto, for example, energy efficiency or water efficiency. It's what the best have done. Now, we're just going to take a couple of minutes to explain some of these other dimensions and encourage you to join us in some future conversations where we'll be answering questions like, how the heck do you cure the fast fashion disease? And I'm going to suggest and explain how, in a future webinar, that we can deliver clothes to people as often as they want, and we can do that in a way that generates 200% more profit, triples our profit, while reducing the cost to the consumer to 1/3 of their current spend. At the same time as doing all of those things, we halve our greenhouse gases and land use. How do we do that? We change the way that we exchange money and value with the people who are accessing the fast fashion. They desperately desire to have more fast fashion. Can we find a way of giving it to them that's exciting? We'll also talk about this question. If you start to think about the way we've designed cars, we believe that cars are designed around the competence of the internal combustion engine. But we now have very different engines, so why are the cars the same? And in this presentation, we'll be talking about if you design the car around the new type of engine, you can deliver 1 litre per 100 kilometre cars. That's 240 miles per gallon for UK listeners, at 10 times more profit than we're currently achieving for the average C segment car at the same cost to the customer. These are really fabulous improvements. I'll be talking about a factory that we hope is going to be built on the island of Mallorca, where none of its raw materials is purchased. Everything is waste that comes from the farms around it. And it turns those raw materials, the waste from those farms, into useful cleaning products for a very busy island with lots of tourists. We're going to be talking briefly about how Industry 4.0 and digitalization plays against sustainability. Are they fighting each other or can they help each other? And the answer, of course, is both. If you do it badly, you will have a fight between two different directions. If you do it well, they will enhance each other. But before I finish, I'd like to come back to the question that people most ask me: what should I do next? And I'm going to slightly flip that question and say, well, rather than give you advice from a place of some expertise, I'll just explain the pattern that we see amongst the very best. What did they do? And I'm afraid they did four things. The first three I've already mentioned. The first thing they did was not to confuse themselves by having 100 different targets. We make things, so we very often we want KPIs, good measurement systems, but if you have 100 KPIs, that doesn't help. And in the best organizations, typically they find the four biggest impacts, and more than 90% of the time, three of those are energy, water and waste, and the fourth one varies depending on which sector you're in. So you may map those against things like sustainable development goals, because you need to report those in different ways to different customers and stakeholders. But internally, the best companies pick 4 targets. For each of those targets, they then start to ask rather simple questions to identify the current waste in the system. So this is really important. We're asking questions to identify waste. We're not asking questions to say, what should we do? What are the solutions? Because what we've observed is that when you can see something as being wasteful, nearly every factory I know is already good at taking that information, seeking the root cause of why that waste exists, and then finding solutions to solve that problem. Most of the time, the solutions are very cheap, I have to say. So what sort of questions are they asking? They're asking things like, well, where is the best place to make a table? What is the best day of the week to make a table? If we use less energy on Thursday than we do on Wednesday, why is that? And that's enough of a question to start an excellent continuous improvement program. So this part is really important. Once you've identified the waste, the third thing that the best do is use their normal processes. So people have different continuous improvement mechanisms, just use those. Don't learn a new one. If you are embedded in total quality management or lean, use those standard techniques for improvement. A small additional piece of advice: if you're doing this in a way that saves energy, I would find a way to bank the benefits. You're reducing the energy bill at the factory, put that money in your pocket because you may want to use it later when you need to start buying technology. For those who've already gone on this journey, the next thing they do is widen their search for value and for waste. So you start moving outside of the direct manufacturing processes, but that's a story for another day. And I hope that we're going to have an exciting set of questions later and that you'll challenge us. We like hard questions. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, guys. Can you hear me? My name is Gary Panter. I'm a visiting fellow at the University of Cambridge. So I'm going to talk about a real case study, which is the UK's largest sugar producer, AB Sugar or British Sugar or Silver Spoon in the shops. And this company is number 1 sugar producer in the UK and number 5 or in the top 5 in the world. And this business I retired from last year was in crisis. In the 1990s, agri-manufacturing was being offshored into other parts of the world, and the business was facing regulatory change and cheaper overseas imports. So the company set up a team, and I was one of the architects in the team, to transform itself. And you can hear a story now of the leading factory called Wissington factory in Cambridgeshire, which became a no-waste biorefinery from a journey of sugar, a commodity, to medicinal cannabis. So some of you may not have seen a sugar beet. This is a sugar beet. It's a root crop, and 3 to 4 million tonnes of these are grown around the factory, about 28 miles from the factory in the UK. The sugar beet contains 17% sugar, 75% water, about 4-5% of fibre, and a few bits and pieces on top, which you'll hear a bit more about later. And all of this is taken into a factory which is the size of a reasonably large town centre. So this is a sugar factory. Very quickly, the sugar beet comes in on the right hand side. About 1,000 lorries a day. It's sliced up into French fries. The sugar is extracted with water and comes out as a black tea. The tea is purified into a straw colour. The syrup is evaporated, or the liquid is evaporated, water evaporated from that to make a syrup, and the syrup is crystallised into sugar, and the sugar is dried and cooled and stored in silos, put in bags in a warehouse, or shipped in tankers to make well-known soft drinks in the UK. And this factory produces about 30 to 40% of the UK's sugar consumption. You see about 3,000 of these factories around the world of this type. But where this factory is different is the journey it took to become not just a sugar producer. The first point of that was looking at the waste streams, the topsoil and stones on your top right of the picture. Many tens of thousands of those that come into the factory with the root crop sugar beet, and they were turned from a landfill waste into a product. So, for example, much of the London Olympics was landscaped with sugar beet topsoil back in 2012 and before. Then the animal feed is a fibre, is dried, and is a very nutritious crop, a product for the animals, sheep and cows in the UK, and the company is the largest, one of the largest producers of animal feed. And then the company made its first big investment. The sugar factory uses a lot of steam, and there was an opportunity to co-generate electricity at the same time. So the company installed a gas turbine power station and made a surplus 50 megawatts of power to sell onto the electricity grid. At the same time as producing steam for the factory, and the steam is used 9 times in the factory before it's discharged. But the 50 megawatts is the size required of a small town. Then the company took another departure, and with the spare heat at the end of its life, the carbon dioxide and the water, it built some large glass houses. And now all of this triangle over here is also glass. And one crop that responds well to large concentrations of carbon dioxide is tomatoes. So the glass house was triple the concentration of CO2 compared to the atmosphere that we breathe. It's quite safe in there, and the tomatoes would grow twice as fast. And the company became the largest supplier of tomatoes grown in the UK. which was a good news to my wife, who liked the fresh taste of those tomatoes. Then the company turned its mind to the other end of the factory, the molasses, which is what's left over after the sugar is processed. It's a sticky brown syrup, and it was built a large biochemical facility using chromatographic separation to separate out the molecules within the molasses. And within the molecules, there's the compound called betaine, which you find in shampoos as a foaming agent, and also is the compound that protects salmon when they're farmed, when they go from freshwater to saltwater. Osmotic protectant, which is the role the chemical has in the sugar beet. And the company became the largest producer of betaine in the world. Also, biochemicals was added. Then in the early noughties, about 15 years ago, the company saw the growth of interest in biofuels, and with the low-grade sugars in the factory, built a fermentation plant to make alcohol, and was the first producer of bioethanol for the UK transport market, and soon after started to capture the carbon dioxide from the fermenters and sold that as an industrial gas. So before long, during that journey, the University of Cambridge was interested in what we were doing, and reflected back to us that it was quite unusual, because we thought this was quite common, and also reflected back to us that the factory was now a no waste biorefinery, which is very, very rare indeed. So we started to work with Cambridge and start to understand the methodologies behind this, and inside the company produced its own rationale for how it developed the methodology, which was the Hubspoke method, which moved from sugar outward into the dark blue, where the resources are and the wastes are available, and turning those wastes into products, which then create new hubs that spin off new businesses. And at Cambridge, there is a value mapping tool that does the same thing. And whilst it wasn't used in the sugar company, you can come and learn the value mapping tool and these techniques from a more generic point of view. That wasn't the end of the journey in terms of the Wisconsin Sugar Factory. 3 years ago, all the tomatoes were switched over to medicinal cannabis. So the company saw an opportunity in the pharmaceutical world for very controlled farming, which tomato production had become, and to take that to the next level to become space-age farming, where traceability is incredibly important for new drugs. And this was a process to make Epidiolex, which is a drug that can control or help relieve the problems of epilepsy in children. And there are over 40,000 sufferers of children in the world who have maybe 60 fits a day, and this brings their life back to them by controlling that condition. And what's interesting about this cannabis, it's got none of the psychotic high elements of the of typical cannabis that I wouldn't know about, but it's got all the calming components of cannabis, which is the active ingredient that's important for the pharmaceutical. And that's now been approved in the US as a drug, and I believe since I left it's been approved also in the UK since I left the company. So that's the journey of a company that started off in sugar as a commodity and is now one of the lowest cost sugar producers in the world. It was facing a battle in agri-manufacturing in terms of cheap imports, and it's used a no-waste philosophy to catapult itself to the top of the competitive ranking. And none of the changes were done on the basis of a green image. It was done through pure payback, in that the company saw this as economic sense. We've now taken that into Steve's team, and I've taken it into Steve's team, and Steve and I are now working on how can we take these lessons into the future, because Wissington Sugar Factory is an example of best practice now, but what will best practice look like in 20 years time? So we're looking at future research, setting up a circular bioeconomy centre. In the dark grey in the middle, there's an agile biorefinery. These big beasts made of concrete and steel are not that agile, but there are more agile methods out there that can be smaller using digital technologies that may mean we recreate biorefineries for the future. And we're working with other universities to look at how we can deconstruct molecules in waste and then reconstruct them to make products and intermediate chemicals and resources for agile biorefineries to put to good use, with an objective in number 5 on the right hand side to convert the whole of the UK, to give the whole of the UK a national plan for a zero waste bioeconomy, so working across sectors, across factories. So if you have interest in joining us in this, we're bidding to the government now to set up the centre. Please contact us after the webinar if you want to get involved and show your support. Okay, I'm now going to hand back to Ian or Rob.
Thank you, Gary. Hopefully you hear me. So we thank you very much, both Gary and Steve, for those insightful and interesting insights into our world, both at the wide and at the very specific ends. We'd like to move now into the Q&A session, and I've had a couple of questions sent live during the broadcasts. If anyone else would like to send anything else in, please do. The idea behind this is that Gary and Steve will be able to provide some of their insights to the things that are vexing you at the moment. We'll try and do as many questions as we can. Before I move on to that, if I can just say that you can also stay connected with us over the next weeks and months. We have a course called Weathering the Climate Crisis that was planned for May and now will take place sometime later in the year. If you're interested in that, then please do let us know by registering interest on our website. Do think about signing up to attend the next webinar, which will be about discovering and eliminating waste. The eliminating waste is particularly interesting when Steve or whoever else will do that part talks about putting on their special glasses. And finally, if you want to know more about IFM and our approach more generally, then do look at the IFM Insights, and you can find out more. We'll send you more about our Sustainability Club, which is something we're setting up at the moment. I'm now going to hand over to Rob Driver to run the Q&A session. Thank you, and over to you, Rob.
So thanks everybody for all of the questions. There's some really good ones in there. We'll start off. We've summarised some of the questions. So I'll just start by saying how many of the questions have been about how to explain or demonstrate the economic benefits of sustainability. So for example, how do you convince your organisational leadership to see the value proposition of adopting circular economy principles? Okay, Steve.
I hope everyone can hear. I think this is one of the hardest questions. If you belong to an organization that really is disinterested and will only ever do the minimum to achieve some sort of certification, you feel that you're trying to fight an uphill battle. That's a very common situation. and the desire to have your organization take sustainability as a strategic goal is great, because that's what you think it should be. But I'm going to suggest that rather than wrestling with the whole of the organization, rather than trying to fight the mass that is the already the current direction of the business. So instead of wrestling, take a judo approach. Let them use their momentum to come in your direction. So how do you do that? And that's where the resource efficiency plays best. If you can reduce overall costs and present a really good story, then that is something that people will go, that's okay, I'm not going to interfere with that. At the moment, it doesn't look like it's strategic. It just looks like some interesting mini projects. Once you start building those mini interesting projects and the money starts coming in and the benefits are there, then we see people slowly shift to being strategic. Now, most factories start with the space that's in between the walls of the factory and the fence. So we start by doing things that are to do with the bins and the waste in the bins and the way in which we generate energy, boilers and things like this. While that is very normal, I'm going to suggest that you also have to get some of those small projects inside the walls of the factory, because that's much more visible. And you're trying to give the factory managers confidence that people who do sustainability projects are not going to destroy their ability to conduct day-to-day production with ease. It's already hard enough. They don't want another problem. So to do that, you have to show that you understand their world, that you're not going to make their world harder. I know this is a sort of non-answer because we're not trying to turn it into a strategic change, but I can assure you that eventually you win the argument.
Great, thank you, Steve. Gary, do you have anything to add from kind of your experience at AB Sugar?
Rob, I think that you focus on the key drivers of the business to get the business attention. So in an agri-manufacturing company, you need water to grow things, you need energy to run a factory, and the factory produces waste. So if you focus sustainability on those key drivers of business success, which also drive profit, then the business is going to take notice, because water efficiency, energy efficiency and waste efficiency are not just sustainable, but they're also profit drivers of the business. So I would advise people to look at their own business and say, what are the key drivers, and apply sustainable practices to those key drivers, because then you'll get a win-win situation. Don't make it different. I think Steve mentioned that earlier.
If I can add one thing into that, I think the other thing, I imagine many of the people in the audience are business-to-business organizations. One thing you can do is you can look upstream. You can look and see what is happening in the companies that you're supplying to, or even further up, the companies they're supplying to. And if you can identify within those organizations that they're starting to make changes and that sustainability is clearly becoming higher on their agenda, and you can often find that information by talking to people or looking at their websites in detail, then you can go back with a stronger case that's not you trying to persuade the people that you're talking to that they need to do something or think differently, but their customers are thinking that way. And that can be very powerful too.
That's great, thank you. So we'll go on to another set of questions that were around how to get started. So for example, someone asked, many areas of the business need improvement in sustainability. Where should I focus my limited resources that will deliver the biggest impact? So who'd like to answer that? Steve?
So if you put a time frame on it and you change the question, where do I use my limited resources today to deliver the biggest impact in the long term? That helps tease apart the problem. If you think I've got to deliver the biggest environmental impact in the next 9 months, then the target areas become those areas where you personally identify the greatest waste. And it might be that you believe your particular factory has a massive water problem or a massive energy problem, and you desperately want to tackle that issue first. I'm going to suggest that getting the franchise, getting empowered to tackle that issue is the medium-term goal. And to gain that franchise, that empowerment from your senior managers is most important. And you do that by demonstrating that you're a very competent, very sensible person who doesn't alter the ability of the factory to perform well. So that gives you a clue about what sort of projects you might work on. Something that is visibly part of the central production system, but something that you know you can confidently improve without destroying everybody's ability to get on with their day job. This makes you seem like a really good collaborator, and I'm suggesting that's a very important first step on the journey. And the very best sustainability stories that I know about come from people who've spent a lot of personal energy, not just making improvements, but making friends and desperately trying not to make enemies because we've already got enough challenges.
Fantastic, Steve. Thank you for that. We've got another set of questions around business models and sustainability. So an example of a question around that was, how do you influence your supply chain when trying to adopt a more sustainable business model? So who'd like to have a crack at that? Okay, Steve again. And then Ian.
So a little bit of a story. We do quite a lot of work around sustainable supply chains. Part of my own personal history was being a director of supply chain development with Nissan in Europe. So I have a very strong enthusiasm for good supply chains. We do a lot of work today in the clothing supply chain, which has the very particular characteristics that brands do not own their own factories, largely, and that those factories are really easy to move from place A to place B. It's very hard to move a car factory from Bangladesh to Ethiopia. It's very easy to move a cut and sew factory from Bangladesh to Ethiopia, and that shapes that particular supply chain, and we do a lot of work in that space. I'm going to suggest, and I've been reading the questions from Emily and from Chris and a couple of others on the supply chain. How do we influence our suppliers? To begin with, if we can improve our own performance and get them engaged in learning, seeing that we're on that journey ourselves, that's important. But I just want to encourage you to ask your suppliers about their annual rate of improvement on water, energy, and material efficiency. Just keep asking and ask them, do they know how good their competitors are in answering the same question? So by bringing information to the problem, you can help your suppliers focus attention on things that can actually work to their advantage. If you are big enough, and some of the questioners, it's not very clear whether you're a really big company or you're a small company piggybacking on other supply chains. If you're a very big company, then typically you've got a very significant effort in managing your suppliers, and you can find ways of working with those supplier teams to reduce water and energy bills, which is seen as a win-win. It's actually quite complex to do that. But it is possible, but only for the big players. For the rest of us, I would just ask the question, How good did you do last year? Was last year better than the year before in terms of water efficiency?
Fantastic, thank you, Steve. Ian, you said you wanted to.
Yeah, if I can take a slightly different perspective on that. One of the things that we work on a lot around business models is trying to understand the value exchanges that underpin how business models work. And we have some very powerful tools that allow businesses to think about how their current exchanges of value are working and where they're failing to work. And when we're running those tools with companies, one of the things we look at is specifically the set of exchanges that go on with their suppliers and partners. And by starting to think hard and about where and how exchanges of value may be not going well between yourself and your suppliers, you can start to identify where there may be opportunities for improvement, and some of that starts to dig into and allow you to understand why you might not necessarily be encouraging suppliers to make sustainable change work for them as well as for you. And so, for example, one of the things we see in the food sector quite extensively is the expectation that we want our suppliers to make improvements and make changes, but then we want to see the cost benefit of those transferred immediately into the price to us in order to pass on to our customers. And as long as we're thinking about value and value exchange in those ways, then we're not going to be encouraging and driving our supply chain partners to do things that are necessarily beneficial for us or for them. So I would say look hard at the way in which you're exchanging value and literally where that value ends up once improvements taken place.
Great, thank you, Ian. Probably got a chance for another couple of questions. We've got one more that was kind of pre-submitted around sustainability and design, and as an example of the type of question in that area, how can we be more sustainable in the design of new products when we have to bring them to market ever faster and cheaper, which encourages the use of known methods of production, which are not always sustainable? So Gary?
Yes, it's a difficult question in terms of the speed of how new products come to market, but my experience of new products and processes is that make sure you understand when you're designing your products what are the biggest impacts on greenhouse emissions, etc. from your products or process. And please try and address those maybe top 2 or 3 items on that list in your design stage. But if you don't understand what your impacts are going to be from your new products, then you're going to have very little chance to impact that. So when we designed the ethanol plants at that sugar factory, we did the full life cycle analysis quite quickly. We understood what we needed to do is to make it an efficient factory, and before there was any benefit in being more greenhouse gas efficient, we built the factory in that way so it will be future proofed. But it's about understanding what your key impacts are going to be in the design stage. You can then make the biggest impact. So please understand before you do, I suppose.
Fantastic. Ian, sorry, Steve wants to say something.
I'm an academic. I always want to say something. When I was being taught engineering design, one of my teachers said a poem: "If in doubt, make it stout, out of stuff you know about." And what they were suggesting was use materials that you've used for the last 2 decades and use a lot of it. This is completely dangerous in the world of desiring to be more sustainable. But it demonstrates the issue that we're trying to deal with here is the appetite of designers who are under immense time pressure to take risks. If you introduce a new material and it fails a final test 6 weeks before launch, this is a massive problem. So if we understand that we are trying to deliver a de-risking of the choice of new materials and new concepts, then we have to think about how we would do that if it was some other aspect of design, not just sustainable. And we would run a prototype system alongside. And when the prototype had proven itself to be ready to go, that it worked, 999 times out of 1,000, then it's ready to go into production. So we must follow the same types of discipline that we would normally bring any radical change into our products. What we found works really well, prototypes. If you have good budgets, doing really good prototypes, often with design houses or consultancies who know more about sustainability. If you have smaller budgets, we found that working with customers, working with students and suppliers, go and engage with local student groups and they'll come up with ideas and you'll see that they'll prototype them to a limited extent and people will see concepts and get excited about them. So consider it to be a risk reduction exercise. If it's not ready, don't push it because the negative consequences will live with you for a long time.
Fantastic. Thank you, Steve. We've just had one additional, given us kind of a few minutes to go. One question from Giovanni in the audience. I had a question around bank the savings. Very often the savings are gobbled up by finance department or through budgetary drops, which acts as a disincentive. Could you talk a little bit about how lean initiatives, doing more with less, can be made into a win-win across departments? Steve?
If I can have another go at this, I actually wrote the answer to this question down. I think that the question's a really good one. If you're lucky and you're able to negotiate with the CEO to turn sustainability into a profit center, so something that the organization invests in, but that investment is expected to create a return, then those savings are banked by allocating the benefits to your profit center. I have to say this doesn't happen very often, but it's an interesting idea. What can happen more often is that you do a negotiation and you say, hey, you're making an investment of employing N people, maybe half a person or one person to tackle this subject. If I can retain 20% of the savings that we make, you can retain 80%. And from those 20%, that allows me to invest further in sustainability direction. So this is a negotiation that you need to have before they realize how big the savings are, right? Get there early. Once they see that you can do things that are significant, they're not going to want to give you 20% of the savings. But while they think it's hard and the benefits are small, you can negotiate 20%. And I would encourage you to do such a deal. Be brave.
And Harry?
Rob, it's quite disheartening to hear that the accountants can be a disincentive to the organisation. I think my suggestion was make a friend of the accountant. I think it's in the accountant's interest to motivate a business to improve in any way it possibly can. And if it motivates a business that the accountant's department can set up a way of tracking the improvements so that it can be celebrated and motivate more, then it's a win-win. You actually if you make a friend of the accountant, you'll probably find your interests are the same, but you're just lacking the mechanism by which you can track the improvements and make sure you motivate people. and that applies to any improvement program. Make a friend.
Fantastic, thank you very much. Well, looking at the time, it's nearly 3 o'clock, so I'll thank you very much for all of those answers and all the questions. I'll just hand back to Ian to close off the session.
Thank you very much, Rob, for guiding us through the Q&A, and I'd like to thank Steve and Gary as well for their time and insights, and for bearing with the slightly clunky technology that we've been dealing with at this end. We're looking forward to and always interested in working with industry, working with companies to continue to build the impact from the research and activities that we've carried out elsewhere. If you're interested in working with us on some of those things, please do contact myself in the first instance, or if you can't get hold of me, Steve or Gary. Take care, and I look forward to seeing you or hearing you again in a month's time. Thank you very much.